Hey guys, it's Tim coming at you with another episode of The Spotlight, the show where I pose an interesting question or just a general interesting idea and have you guys take it from there in the comments. With that being said, Deadpool seems to be doing pretty well for itself. It broke the record for the opening weekend for an R-rated movie and is still coming in at number one even this many weeks later, though to be fair, it hasn't had much competition in that front. And because of this, it's opened up the dialogue about R-rated comic book movies moving forward. And before anyone says this, yes, Deadpool is by no means the first R-rated comic book movie, but it is by a far margin the most successful R-rated comic book movie. That's why people are taking notice of this now as opposed to, say, back when Blade came out. And though Blade was definitely a turning point, especially for Marvel in terms of movie making, and while it did well for itself relatively, it by no means pulled in the same numbers as Deadpool. And if we look over at DC, they had Watchmen as probably their most well-known R-rated movie, since outside of graphic novel adaptations, DC doesn't have a huge amount of R-rated movies. But then you have the downside of R ratings, and probably some of the biggest reasons why people have been holding off on having this conversation for so long. And those would mostly be the Punisher movies, all of which were R-rated, none of which did well. If not explicitly financially, then absolutely critically. So, now that that's done, and we have an R-rated movie that's doing well enough for Hollywood to take notice, how do you think that the R rating should be used in the future of comic book movies? Now, we have the rumor mill going that Wolverine 3 will likely get an R-rated movie, most likely because of how well Deadpool did at the same studio. And that worked well for the character. Wolverine has always been a fairly violent, bloody character, so this will finally allow him to cut loose and allow them to make a Wolverine movie that's closer to how Wolverine's portrayed in the comics, at least visually as opposed to character-wise, because character-wise they've done fine so far. But what about the MCU and the DC Extended Universe? Well, looking at what they have in their lineup, they don't really have a huge amount of characters that I feel really would benefit from having an R rating, in that it's really not all that necessary. With characters like Wolverine and Deadpool, they're either explicit enough in terms of violence or in terms of how raunchy they are that the R rating makes sense, but you're really not going to need an R rating to tell a good Captain America movie, or to tell a good Spider-Man movie, or a good Superman movie. Not that you couldn't tell a good movie with those characters at the R-rated level, but it's just not entirely necessary. And if the studios look at it that way, they're probably not going to move forward so much with it in those particular movies. Probably the biggest contender in terms of what we know now between the two of them that is going to have an R rating as opposed to the R rated cut of Batman vs. Superman would probably have been Suicide Squad, but because they were working on it, and I'm pretty sure wrapped filming before Deadpool was even released, they really don't have a lot they can do with that, and they're stuck at the PG-13, which can still likely do well, and they can still tell the story fine. I'm just saying that was probably their best option in terms of what we know they have coming out. But, hey, if it does well, maybe a sequel can be at an R rating. But at the same time, when you're trying to build a universe like that and you're trying to make it as accessible as possible, it may not be the best option to even put an R-rated movie into the MCU or the DC Extended Universe. I mean, in terms of universe building, if all of the movies are PG-13 and that level of audience can get in, and then suddenly there's a movie that only people 17 and up can get into, well, then that movie, A, is probably going to do worse than the others, and B, is going to leave a hole in the universe. And while they tend to tell self-contained stories as best they can, it still can kind of hurt the universe-building aspect of the movies if one of them is this outlier that certain audience members can't see. But maybe they shouldn't care about that. Maybe they should just look at each movie individually. Or maybe they can tell the stories in other ways. I mean, the Marvel Netflix series, which are tied into the MCU, if they were movies, they would be R rated for language and violence. So, that outlet actually gives them a better option for being able to tell that kind of story without leaving out audience members from theaters, because you can decide what you watch at home, and you don't have to worry about the rating in terms of being able to get in. But what do you guys think? How should the comic book industry move forward in terms of R ratings in movies? Well, let us know in the comments below, and until next time, this has been Tim from the Spotlight, signing out.